I suggested an open marriage to my fiancé in therapy 2 weeks before our wedding, and now he's giving me the silent treatment. I mean, can you believe that? After 9 years of knowing each other and 5 years together, he just completely shuts me out over one little conversation. Between us, I wanted to scream when he walked out of that therapist's office, but I kept it together because that's what I do. I'm Chloe, by the way, and I'm 28. And I honestly thought Mark was the one I'd spend my life with until everything exploded. Mark and I met at this boring academic event our dads dragged us to. His dad is some hotshot professor, and mine is too, so they run in the same circles. I only went because my mom bailed last minute. Turns out my parents were going through a rough patch because of my dad's affair. But nobody told me that then. Mark was standing there looking all cute and uncomfortable in his suit. And I just knew. You know that feeling? When you just know someone's going to be important in your life? We started dating a year later, and 5 years after that, he proposed. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. I've always been the stressed one in our relationship. Mark is just so chill. Like nothing bothers him. Meanwhile, I'm over here worrying about everything. Work was getting insane last year, so I started seeing a therapist to help manage my stress. Dr. Evans seemed nice enough at first. She listened to all my work problems, and then somehow, our sessions started shifting more toward my relationship with Mark. I didn't mind at first because I thought it was all connected. My stress, my relationship, everything. Then my friend Sophie went through this awful situation. Her husband, who'd had like 70 partners before they got married, 70? Can you even imagine? Suddenly decided he wanted an open marriage after they said their vows. Poor Sophie was miserable. And when we had lunch, she just unloaded on me. She kept looking at me with this worried expression and said, "Honey, Mark had 26 partners before you. That's a lot. You need to be careful." That comment stuck with me. I won't lie. I started noticing things about Mark I hadn't really thought about before. Dr. Evans latched onto this story when I told her. She got this weird look in her eyes and started asking all these questions about Mark's history versus mine. I'd only been with 3 guys before Mark, and suddenly that seemed like a problem. Dr. Evans kept saying how men with that much experience often can't be satisfied with just one woman. She planted this seed in my head that Mark would eventually cheat or leave me if I didn't do something. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I mean, why wouldn't he want more experience? I was basically holding him back. 2 weeks before our wedding, I told Mark I wanted him to come with me to a therapy session. I said it was so we could be completely honest with each other before getting married. That sounds nice, right? I wasn't being sneaky. I just wanted us to have this conversation in a safe space with a professional who could help Mark understand. He seemed a little hesitant, which I should have noticed was a red flag. But I just thought he was nervous about therapy. The day of the session, I got there early and talked with Dr. Evans. I explained everything again, my concerns, Sophie's story, my fears about Mark eventually leaving me for someone with more experience. Dr. Evans nodded along and said she'd help me communicate this to Mark. When he arrived, she shook his hand and made this weird comment about how he wasn't what I'd described. I didn't think much of it then, but now I wonder what she meant. Mark just smiled that polite smile he does when he's uncomfortable. Dr. Evans started with this whole speech about modern relationships and non-traditional marriages. Mark was nodding along, probably thinking I was going to say something about not wanting to be a traditional housewife or whatever. And, I mean, that was part of it. I do want to keep my career and have my own life. But then Dr. Evans looked at me, and I knew it was my turn. I took Mark's hand. His hands were so cold, which I should have noticed was a bad sign, and I just said it. I think we should have an open marriage, I told him, where I can see other people. The silence that followed was intense. Mark just stared at me, and Dr. Evans jumped in to explain that this would help level the playing field, since Mark had so much more experience than me. She said it would actually strengthen our relationship in the long run. I was nodding along, feeling more confident as I spoke. I explained that I loved him and didn't want to lose him, but this was something I needed. Then I added the part about how I wouldn't be comfortable with him seeing other women because I'd be too jealous and worried someone might steal him away. I mean, that's fair, right? I can't help how I feel. Mark was quiet through this whole speech, which I took as a good sign. I thought he was processing it, maybe even considering it. Then he turned to Dr. Evans and asked if she was licensed. I was confused. Why would he ask that? Of course she was licensed. She said yes, looking a little taken aback. And then Mark dropped the bomb. I want you to explain to my fiancé why we're no longer getting married and won't be continuing to be a couple starting immediately. He said, so calmly it was scary. Wish you both luck. And then he just walked out. Just like that. 5 years together, 2 weeks before our wedding. And he walks out because I suggested something that could actually help our relationship in the long run. I was stunned. Dr. Evans looked just as shocked. I started crying, and she tried to comfort me, saying some men just aren't evolved enough to understand modern relationship structures. That made sense to me. Mark had always been a bit traditional in some ways. I called him immediately after leaving the therapist's office, but he didn't answer. I texted. I called his best friend. I called his brother. Nothing. Complete silence. The next day, I found out he'd canceled all our wedding plans, even the loan application for the house we were going to buy. He was serious about this. Over one conversation, one little suggestion that he wasn't even willing to discuss. Our families started asking questions. Of course. How do you explain that your wedding was canceled 2 weeks before the big day? I told people we'd had a disagreement, which was the understatement of the century. Mark was clearly telling people something different, though I don't know what. His family was giving me these weird looks. I just knew he was painting me as the villain here, when all I was trying to do was save our relationship from future problems. A week after the therapy session, I found out Mark had reported Dr. Evans to her clinic and to the American Psychological Association. He'd somehow gotten in touch with other patients of hers who had complaints too. I couldn't believe it. This man who never gets upset about anything was going after my therapist, like she'd personally wronged him. Okay, fine. Maybe the session didn't go great. But was it really worth all this? He was acting like she'd suggested I murder him or something. I was desperate to talk to Mark, to explain everything properly. I showed up at his work one day, just waited in the lobby until he had time to see me. He looked tired but agreed to talk. That's when I told him everything about the work stress, about Sophie's situation, about my parents' marriage problems I'd recently discovered, and about the miscarriage. Oh yeah, the miscarriage. I found out I was pregnant a few weeks before the wedding. I was going to tell Mark in some special way, make it perfect. But then I started bleeding, and just like that, it was over. I never told him because I was worried he'd think I was broken or inadequate. He wants kids so badly, and I was afraid he'd see me differently if he knew I couldn't give him that right away. I know it doesn't make much sense now, but in my stressed-out state, it seemed like a valid concern. When I told Mark about the miscarriage, I saw something in his eyes change. He was still angry, still hurt, but there was a flicker of understanding too. I gave him a copy of the recording I'd made of our therapy session. I'd started recording my sessions for my own reference, and luckily this one was captured too. When he listened to it, I think he finally heard what I was actually trying to say versus how it came out. We talked for hours that day and for several days after. I explained how Dr. Evans had encouraged this idea, how she'd validated my worst fears about Mark eventually leaving me. I admitted that maybe I hadn't handled it well, but my intentions were good. I was trying to prevent future heartache, not cause immediate pain. Mark had to go out of town for work about a week after we started talking again. He was supposed to be gone for 2 weeks, but it turned into a month. That time apart was actually good for us. We texted and called, working through things slowly. We still had these non-refundable plane tickets to France for what was supposed to be our honeymoon. The trip was scheduled for 3 months after the wedding date, so it was coming up fast. Mark suggested we still go. Just as friends, I was hesitant at first, would it be too painful? But we decided to give it a try. France was magical. There's something about being in a different country that puts everything in perspective. We talked a lot there, really talked. Without the distractions of everyday life. We visited museums, walked along the Seine, ate way too much bread and cheese, and somewhere between the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre, we found our way back to each other. We came back from France as a couple again, but things are different now. We agreed on some changes. I'm looking for a new job with less stress. We're not hanging out with Sophie and her husband anymore. Toxic influence, as Mark calls them. I'm seeing a new therapist, someone who doesn't have an agenda. And when we do get married, it's going to be a small ceremony with just our immediate family. Mark still has some trust issues, which I get. I offered him full access to my phone and location, but he refused. He said that's not the kind of relationship he wants. We're working on being more transparent with each other in healthy ways. I've promised no more secrets, especially about something as important as a pregnancy. I know some people will read this and think I got off easy, and maybe I did. Mark and I both made mistakes. He should have been more communicative about his feelings. And I shouldn't have let a therapist plant these ideas in my head without talking to him first. But we're working on it. That's what people do when they love each other. Right. They work through the hard stuff. Sometimes I still think about what would have happened if I'd never gone to Dr. Evans. Or if Sophie hadn't planted those seeds of doubt. But I can't change the past. All I can do is move forward with Mark and hope we've learned something from this whole mess. We're even talking about Italy for our next trip. Maybe this time it'll be a real honeymoon.